Hi, and welcome to this screencast on the Introduction to Imperialism. In this screencast, we're going to talk a little bit about the key definitions that you're going to need in this unit, as well as some of the essential questions and big issues that you're going to tackle over the next several weeks. So let's get started. So first of all, I wanted to go over some of the essential questions that you want to be asking yourself as you go through the unit, and that way you'll know what to take the notes on. So the first question is, what were the motives for imperialism in Africa? So by motives, what we're talking about are the reasons why European countries wanted to start to try to control other countries. So we're going to go over a group of motives, and actually the term empire is going to be the acronym that will help you remember what the different motives are. And then we want to think about which motives were the most powerful and the most significant. And then finally, the last thing that you're going to ask yourself are what were the short-term as well as what are the long-term consequences of imperialism in India as well as in the Congo. Those are two countries that we're going to be studying a little bit more specifically. So as you're taking notes in this screencast as well as throughout the rest of this unit, those are the things that you want to be focusing most of your attention. So look at this picture of Africa. I think this is a really great way to kind of think about the idea of imperialism. As you can see around the outside, all of these are different European countries. So we have Spain, Portugal, Italy, Germany, Great Britain, Belgium, and France. And they're all tugging at the shores of the big country of Africa. And then if you notice over here, there's another question, and this is a big question that you want to be thinking about as you're learning this unit. We're going to be talking about when different countries are intervening in the affairs of others. Sometimes it's acceptable to do so, and other times it isn't. The reason this is important is because imperialism isn't just something that happened in the past, it's also happening today. Many people think that the United States invasion of Iraq was an imperialistic move. And so we want to be thinking about why did we do that? Was it acceptable? What was the long and short-term consequences, etc. Here's another picture of Africa, and if you notice at the bottom here it says about in the middle of the 19th century. So that's in the 1800s. And as you can see, most of the inside of the country, the interior of the country, was totally unexplored. And the rest of it around the outside, you can see little bits of British, Dutch, and Danish kind of coming into the Ivory Coast and the Gold Coast. And down here there's a colony called the Cape Colony. The Portuguese were controlling bits of East Africa. Now watch this. This is 1914 in Africa, and as you can see, there's a huge difference. So what we're going to be looking at is something called the Scramble for Africa, where all of these countries right here, Belgium, France, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Portugal, Spain, all of these countries tried to stake claims into different parts of Africa. You can already start to think about what would be the long-term consequences of that. For instance, in Algeria, which was controlled by France, the language that they still speak in Algeria is French. And in South Africa, they speak English. So those are what the people speak in those countries. There are obviously still native languages, but those are some of the consequences that we were going to be learning about. Let's get into some definitions. I think this is really important. If you're studying a unit on imperialism, you should definitely know what the definition is. So the most important, whoa, what happened? Sorry about that. The most important word in this definition is domination. Okay, when a country is imperialistic, it dominates another country. It might dominate it politically, economically, socially, all three of them. And it could be a region or it could be a country. And the other thing about imperialism is you could be dominated from very far away. Some people actually talk about economic imperialism of the United States in the form of McDonald's. So our culture and the social life of the United States is impacting other countries not because we have soldiers there, but because we have our fast food chains there. So why don't you take a minute and think for yourself, and you can brainstorm What are examples of imperialism that you can think of? I mentioned two already, and you can start to think about what other ones there might be. So pause this right now and think about that. Did you come up with a lot of ideas? If you don't have more than three, you probably want to stop and think some more or ask for help. Here's another definition that I think is really important: colonialism. Colonialism is a type of imperialism. It's a type of imperialism when the country takes direct control and creates settlements in the other country. Okay, so a type of imperialism where you're creating settlements. So again, why don't you think of an example of colonialism that we've already studied this year, and you can pause this screencast while you're doing so. And finally, the last definition that's important is empire. You certainly know from the movies, The Empire Strikes Back and Darth Vader here, an empire is the group of countries or the territory that is under the control of a supreme leader or of another country. So when we talk about the British Empire, those are not Great Britain, but all of the other places that the British control. Speaking of the British Empire, there's a saying that says the sun never sets on the British Empire. The reason why is because Britain is right here, this small little country right here. It controls all of Canada, a bunch of islands in the Caribbean, a little bit of South America, a bunch of different areas in Africa, in the Indian subcontinent, and in Australia. This, by the way, is in the year 1920, so Britain doesn't control all of these areas, but in the early 1900s, around the time of World War I, Britain controlled places on every continent in the world. So let's get back to Africa for just a minute. It's really important to think about what Africa was like before imperialism, because that will help you understand why it was controlled by Europe. The most important thing about Africa is we talk about it as one place, but it really isn't. It's an incredibly diverse country or continent. There are many different languages, cultures, governments, traditions. The geography is totally different. There's some really, really deep and dense jungles. There's flatlands, there's deserts, and so the entire continent is very, very diverse, and the cultures are diverse. So there's communities that have that are nomadic, which means they move around a lot, and small little villages, as well as large centralized states. Why did Europe care about Africa? The biggest reason in the 1500s and 1600s was the trade. There's a lot of resources in Africa that Europeans were interested in. However, the big thing that they were really trading was slaves, and the reason why is because there's something called the Triangle of Trade, which I'll show you a picture of so you can actually see the triangle. But there's three parts to it. Slaves go from Africa to the New World, to the Americas. In the Americas, they produce raw materials and send those raw materials to Europe. And then in Europe, they manufacture the goods and they send them to Africa and trade them for more slaves. So here's the visual of it. So we'll start in Africa. So European slave trips would come to the coast of Africa. They would trade with Africans for other Africans so that they would have slaves. They would take them across the ocean to the Americas. Here they would do things like there was molasses, sugar, tobacco, cotton, things like that were produced here, and those were shipped over to Europe, and then they took those things and they produced manufactured goods like shirts and clothes and cigarettes and other things like that. And then they would take all of what they made and bring it down to Africa to sell. Rum was another one that they would manufacture using the sugars. So it wasn't until the late 1700s that the Europeans started to get into the inside of Africa. Mostly they would just come to the ports and to the exterior on the oceans, and they would trade there. So I want you to, again, stop for a minute and pause the video and think about what happens in the late 1700s, in the early 1800s, that allows Europe to become a dominant force in the African country. And this is a picture that might help you think about it, and I'll give you another hint that you just finished studying it in the previous unit. Got it? That's right, it's the Industrial Revolution. So the Industrial Revolution, there were three main things that came out of the Industrial Revolution that were really important in terms of letting the Europeans have a better access to the interior of Africa. So first of all, money. Okay, there's just a lot of wealth that was created in the Industrial Revolution, and that money could fund expeditions where they would send ships off to other places to find things. There's also increases in technology. The weapons that the Europeans brought overpowered the native Africans, as well as the ability for transportation. Remember the steam engine? So eventually they had steam ships that could power their way up the rivers and into the interior of Africa. And as well as there were many inventions in medicine, and so there's diseases that were only found in Africa that the Europeans were very, very susceptible to, and so the medicines helped them to stay healthy when they were going on these explorations. The other important thing is that the Industrial Revolution created a desire for more resources. They had these giant factories growing and manufacturing things, but they needed the things to put in them. So they needed all the raw materials that were going to go into this industrial process. So then we get to the Scramble for Africa. And the Scramble for Africa was in the 1800s when the European explorers started to push inward. All of the European countries wanted to claim territory. And so what happened was they ended up starting to fight with each other because they were so eager to claim different regions of Africa for themselves. And so what this led to is something called the Berlin Conference. So there was discontent, there was tension among Europeans. Back to this picture, you see them all pulling, sweating, and getting upset with each other. Down here, actually, there was a battle between Great Britain and the Dutch called the Boer Wars, where they were fighting each other over the control of South Africa. So what did they do? Well, they met in Berlin at something called the Berlin Conference. This is one of those key historic events. It was in 1884. And one of the reasons it was key is because they were talking about how they were going to decide what to do with Africa, and not a single African was there to talk to them about it. So what they did was they made some decisions saying you can claim Africa, but you have to have a government office there. You can't just put a flag down and say that you control the country. And so what that did was it led to colonialism. It led to the European countries actually bringing officials and governments and setting up settlements in Africa. The other important thing, and this is getting to the essential question around the consequences, is that there were local boundaries. There were different tribes in Africa, and some of them got along well and other ones didn't. Because the Berlin Conference didn't have any Africans there, the Europeans didn't really think about what the Africans would think about how they drew the boundaries. And so what we will learn is that sometimes they would take two warring tribes and they would put them into a country and call it one country together. If you're familiar with the Rwandan genocide that happened, that was mainly caused by the fact that two different tribes of groups were put into one country called Rwanda. In some cases, they took tribes and split them up so that one was controlled by Germany and another was controlled by France, even though they felt like their cousins were right across the river from each other. So that's another example. The other thing that's important to understand is that it's actually a myth that when the Europeans took over Africa, that the Africans just let them. There were many, many fierce battles. In Algeria, there was a big battle with the French. The Zulus in South Africa was also Zulus was one of the kind of centralized states, and it was an empire in and of itself, and they fought the British, as well as the Yao and the Herero fighting the Germans in East Africa. So there was actually quite a bit of resistance, but it failed, and the reason that it failed was, first of all, sometimes the Africans would fight against each other. They had cultural differences, and they certainly couldn't kind of band together to fight as one. The biggest thing, though, was the technology. As you'll learn when we get into the semester 2 and World War I, the machine gun was a huge revolution in the ability to kill many people. And so one machine gunner European machine gunner could fight off dozens and dozens of Africans. They had the steamships that I mentioned, and just a lot of superior technology. And then just as the Africa had some diseases that the Europeans could catch, that the Africans had resistance to, the Europeans had diseases that the Africans didn't have resistance to. So just like when the settlers came to the Americas and so many died through disease, the same thing happened in Africa as well. There were only two countries that successfully were not taken over. Liberia is one of them, and Ethiopia is the other. Those are the only two countries in all of Africa that maintained independence all the way through this imperialistic time.